to recognize how one could experience both justice and mercy at the same time. Justice in that cross, the cross is where justice is seen in mercy, and that I am forgiven. And both at the same time. Thus, the cross of Christ was in accord with God's wisdom. But God is not only wise, God is also holy. Holiness is God's foremost attribute, in my opinion. I believe that every other attribute of God flows from His holiness. I believe His wisdom is a holy wisdom. His love is a holy love. His grace is a holy grace. And I've explained that before in other times, so I won't spend too much time with it now. But here's my point. Holiness means God's separateness, God's otherness, His absolute uniqueness. There is none like God. And it references His purity. No sin is within Him at all. And He has nothing to do in sin. He is not a sinner Himself. Thus it was fitting with the holiness of God that Christ should die, because His holiness cannot receive sin. He cannot tolerate sin. And the only way that sinners, we could be reconciled to God is through Christ, because God cannot receive us as we are. I believe it was Jonathan Edwards who says, not too many people deny that hell exists, they just all fancy themselves that they will escape it. Not too many people deny that hell exists, they just fancy that they will be the ones who escape it. But the holiness of God means we all deserve it. And we shouldn't fancy ourselves being able to escape it, unless the grace of God come upon us. There's no reason why any of us should look at the face of hell and say, I don't deserve that. Because God is holy. God has no obligation to us. But in His love, He extends it unobligated. And that He does that is an example of His holiness, because His holiness says He cannot tolerate sin. He will not tolerate sin. So He sends Christ to take care of sin. He sends Christ to be our sin bearer. And in doing so, God shows forth His holiness. Because God says, I'm not going to just look over it. I'm not just going to look past it. I'm not just going to say it didn't happen. I'm going to punish it through a substitute. In that, God shows that He is both wise and holy. He is wise in how He did it. He is holy in that He did it. And that He didn't just look over it, but that He did send Christ. Thirdly, He is righteous. The cross of Christ was fitting with the character of God, because God can by no means simply clear the guilty. And I've asked you this before. How would you feel if you sat in a courtroom and you saw a mass murderer like, I don't know, Ted Bundy? And Ted Bundy stood before the judge absolutely guilty of all the crimes that he'd committed, and the judge looked at him and said, you're okay, go. You're free. Every one of us would look at that judge and say, you need to be impeached. You need to be off the bench because you're unjust. You're not righteous. How then can God look at a sinner like me and say, you're free to go, Keith? You don't know the depth of depravity of my soul, but you know the depth of depravity of your own. Could God truly look at you and say, go free and be just? Only with a substitute. Only through Christ can God be both just and merciful and righteous and holy at the same time. That's why the phrase begins, for, linking it to the statement before, which is about substitutionary atonement. That's what the verse 9 was about. That's what it says, for it was fitting. For it was accordance with the character of God. Because God is just, He is merciful, He is wise, and He is holy. And in those things, what Christ did was fitting with the character of God. Christ came, and He fulfills the righteous demands of the law. He takes the punishment for those who have broken the law. And God's wrath can be abated for those who believe on Him. His righteousness is satisfied. Punishment upon sins has been levied, and His grace has been shown freely. God's nature is wise, and the cross of Christ was befitting God's wisdom. God's nature is holy, and the cross of Christ was befitting His holiness. God's nature is righteous, and the cross of Christ was befitting His righteousness. God's nature is gracious, and the cross of Christ was befitting His grace. And God's nature is loving, and the cross of Christ was befitting His love. This is why the writer says, "For it was fitting that He, for whom and by whom all things exist, and bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." Now let's move to the second part of the verse I want to look at, and that is the phrase, founder of their salvation. Founder of their salvation. This is really the meat of the lesson today. What I've just given is an introduction, because that's the introduction to the verse. For it was fitting that He should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. If you were to think of it that way, that's what it's trying to say. And the founder of their salvation is the crux of the text. We're talking about why Jesus became a man. We've noted that this passage tells us it was in accord with the character of God. This much is an obvious fact because God did it. But this passage also tells us something about Jesus. It says that as a man, He was the founder of our salvation. Now, what does the word mean when we say He was the founder of our salvation? The word is archegon, and it means to be a chief leader. In the King James Version, it is translated captain. I always like that phrase. It says He's the captain of our salvation. I always thought of it kind of in like in naval terms. He's the captain of the ship. He's the leader of the vessel. He's the one who is going out before. And if you keep in mind New Testament days, the phrase archegon, the phrase captain, would have, today oftentimes we think of the captain as a guy who just sits and gives orders. But in New Testament days, the captain, the archegon, the one who is the leader, was out in front. He goes before the group, and by that he is an example of valor to his men. He takes the sword and runs headlong the charge. He doesn't stand in the back and say, "Go." He goes out in front and says, "Come." That's the title of emphasis and dignity that is being given to Christ in this passage. It reminds us that Christ has literally gone on ahead. He has gone to pave the way. In a sense, the word can be translated pioneer. He is the pioneer of salvation. He came to earth to blaze a trail that we could follow. He made the way that we couldn't make for ourselves. You see, we cannot save ourselves. We're like children who are caught in the woods. Imagine a little 3 or 4 year old child in the middle of the woods. They would walk and they wouldn't know direction. They wouldn't understand north or south. They wouldn't understand where they were going. They're just lost. The parent comes to the child, he takes the hand of the child, and he pushes through the bush. He pushes through the brush, and he moves everything out of the way and says, "There's the camp. There's where we're going." We cannot save ourselves. We cannot find the pathway of salvation for ourselves. So Christ in love comes to us, and He takes us by the hand. And in love, He leads us to salvation. And in that, He becomes our founder of salvation. He becomes our pioneer. He becomes our leader. And the term founder of salvation is written as a note of encouragement. Because anytime someone follows a leader, you have to place your trust in the leader. You know that to be true. Trust is a prerequisite. You have called me as the pastor of the church. As pastor of the church, I am in many ways the leader of the church. There has to be a trust relationship there. The elders have to have a trust relationship with the congregation. Anybody who leads you, there has to be trust. Trust is given to the leader and says, you're going to lead me in the right direction. And what this passage tells us is the founder of salvation is Christ. He is the ultimate leader, and we have placed our trust in one who is most trustworthy. Men will fail, but God will never fail. Men will fail, but Christ will never fail. And Christ is the one to whom we have put our trust in as our pioneer. He came to earth to lead us to heaven. Remember John 14? Jesus gave those wonderful words, and I often preach this verse at funerals. When John 14, Jesus said, let not